All right, so we'll get started. Good morning. Hello, everybody. We're here to talk about something that we call inclusive architecture, using something that we call the PAM stack. And the purpose of this is to really support diversity on your teams through the mechanism of helping junior developers and making your teams more supportive of junior developers. We're going to talk about some things that help those developers as well as things that will help all of your whole team. So we like to playfully call this the PAM stack because we feel like everybody needs to have a stack these days. So our PAM stack stands for process, abstractions, and mentorship. And we're going to talk about each of these throughout the talk.
So we will talk a lot in terms of how the PAM stack actually enables junior developers, but really this talk is mainly focused on the entirety of inclusive architecture and what it enables. So if you have an inclusive architecture on your team, that means you have less maintenance because you have a code base that's actually more approachable to a wider set of developers. You have less stress on your team, which means you have more retention and it helps you save money. Because if you have less stress on your team, then you have, less issues with conflict resolution, more team buy-in, more cooperation. It also lowers the cost over time of developers because you have a more approachable code base, which means that you don't have to spend top dollar on every headcount. It also lowers the cost of the project. Some of the conversations that we'll be having today about the PAM stack will talk about different technologies and tools that you can use to enable your developers better. Also, more inclusion. This idea of having a more inclusive architecture means that you can actually hire better, more diverse developers because all of a sudden you have access to a wider candidate pool.
So we'll take a step and reintroduce ourselves. So my name is Ocel. I'm a senior developer at this.labs. I host a couple of our podcasts like the Modern Web podcast and the this.labs podcast, and just really enjoy talking about the PAM stack, web frameworks, mentorship, and things like that. So if you want to have those conversations, I'm happy to.
My name is Tracy. I am the CEO of this.labs. We're a JavaScript consultancy. We're framework agnostic. I'm also on the RxJS core team, so I love RxJS. I'll be giving a talk about that later. I'm also a Google developer expert and Microsoft MVP. And then I do a lot of other exciting things like community relations for Node. So if you want to talk about JavaScript, feel free to chat with me.
Yeah, we always joke there's a reason why her slide is second, because she's a tough act to follow.
I do too much. So let's just really quickly talk about why there's this idea that juniors are not as successful on development teams. A lot of times we say, hey, this is actually the fault of the juniors, right? Maybe they don't have enough experience, et cetera. But in actuality, maybe we're thinking about it wrong. Maybe juniors are not successful on teams because of the fault of the teams. Because when you're not making inclusive decisions in your code base, you're not making good decisions on how to structure the team, this may actually be the reason that they're failing. But again, the decisions about this actually affect everybody, not just junior developers.
So let's talk about some of the things that our teams do that might cause juniors to fail. So one of them is when we have poor onboarding documentation, or just poor documentation in general. This means that people have to ask questions about absolutely everything, right? All of your team members, your juniors included, want to be able to answer their own questions, but if you don't have any documentation, they have no choice but to ask, and this grates on everybody's nerves. Or your team might rely on individual excellence. This means you need everybody on your team to be doing the absolute peak of their ability in order to succeed. You need people to be knowledgeable about things that they might only get with years of experience. And this means that your juniors have to be micromanaged on these teams, or else they're going to make mistakes that ultimately hurt your users. Or your team might have an unnecessarily complex code base. It might be the best and the coolest thing that you could have built, but if it's unnecessarily complex, it means that juniors have no way to make meaningful contributions without worrying about causing regressions or making mistakes that's really outside of what they should be responsible for. Or your teams might not have review and mentorship. And if your teams don't have review and mentorship, this means that your junior developers stay junior developers forever. They never get a chance to get the feedback that's critical for them to grow and develop in their careers.
So the reason why this actually hurts everybody, not just junior developers, is because if you have poor onboarding documentation, that means every single person you bring onto a team has to learn something, and everybody has to spend time teaching this person. Also, it's very inconsistent. Depending on who's onboarding that person, there could be, disconnects or, different things. Also, everybody basically needs to be senior because you need to basically have the ability to just jump in and be successful. Also, individual excellence. So when we rely on senior developers, you have this thing like we like to call the hit by a bus fears. This means all of a sudden, one person might understand one part of the system, and if you lose them, it could take months or even years to actually refactor and reverse engineer what they actually built, right? Because nobody knows what's going on. Complex code bases as well. When your code base is complex and it deviates from industry standards, that means that everything's hand-rolled, and it's so difficult for anybody to get productive immediately. One of my friends, he's the CTO at one of the top 10 websites, and he said that it takes a year for a developer to feel like they're productive. That hurts, right? And also, so if you're relying on best standards and best practices, then that helps somebody be productive from day one. Also, lack of advancement. It was actually quite funny because we just rolled out a mentorship program for our entire team. And I remember Rob said some of our senior developers said, "Am I being punished? Did I do something wrong?" And it's like, no. We believe that even senior developers need to have mentors so that they can be successful within their careers, right? Just because you're a senior developer does not mean that you don't need help as well to advance to the next level.
So teams that are doing these things right tend to look like this. So these teams, individuals in these teams succeed primarily through teamwork and collaboration. So teams don't succeed just because people are individually excellent, but rather that they work together to achieve excellence. You can decrease unnecessary complexity and focus on the important features because you have an application that's geared for everyone to make meaningful contributions at their level of skill. You're going to have more innovation, more excitement, and more learning because you have people at all levels, again, bringing things that they're interested in. It kind of creates these conversations in this vibrant community that really keeps your teams excited to come into work every day and learn new things. And you're going to have a wider and more diverse set of engineers and skills on your team. Again, if you can support junior engineers and the wider array of engineers that you have access to so many more diverse pipelines of talent that a lot of other people don't have access to.
So let's get back to the PAM stack. These ideas, again, within the PAM stack are supposed to try to help you build inclusive teams. The first thing is actually process. So a lot of people might hear that word process, especially from the development side, and say, "Oh, forget it."
Yeah, but give us a chance. We might be able to win you over on this one. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a description of a team that has no process. And when I do this, I want you to think if this describes any teams that you might previously have been on or you might be on now. No shame. I've been on these teams too. So on these teams, processes are usually ad hoc and chaotic. The organization usually does not provide a stable environment to support processes. So success in these organizations depends on the competence and the heroics of people in the organization and not on the use of proven processes. These organizations are characterized by a tendency to overcommit, abandon their processes in a time of crisis, and be unable to repeat their successes. So if you're like me, when you hear that, you're like, sounds a lot like our teams. Things get really crazy around releases, and we don't have time to reach back and help the younger or the more junior members of our team to keep up because I'm slammed all day long getting things done. It doesn't have to be this way. We can fix this. And we can do it with process, but process doesn't have to be endless meetings or buzzwords or any of the types of things that you might have heard. And it doesn't have to mean lots of mountains of paperwork or spreadsheets that you have to push around. There can be a better way and a simpler way to do this.
So if you do process right, it should actually help your team because all of a sudden you have clear expectations, expanded team engagement and cooperation. There's no single points of failure. We talked about that hit by a bus thing. Everybody knows what's going on, and it's not just one person that has siloed the information. Things are documented, which means that people can learn independently. There's also less stress during the launch times and the crazy times. And hopefully, process also should help you reduce conflicts and power struggles within the organization.
And we'll talk about all these.
So, there's many different process methodologies, and no one is best, right? But they basically have the same format. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you're defining expectations, meaning when things are not stressful, when things are calm, you're sitting down and writing different things, writing down what you expect people to do in various situations. Then you're also describing how to meet expectations, meaning you're talking about how to actually do the plan or creating step-by-step things, having training, making sure you're verifying as well while you're doing things that expectations are met, reviewing things, not just code, reviewing requirements, designs, meeting notes, process plans, documentation, client-facing things, and recording the results, right? Finding meaningful metrics and saying, hey, I should be doing, keeping track of these things. For example, maybe the types of defects, the code estimates, planned versus actual, the churn per sprint. And then also, after you're doing all these things, making sure you're stopping and saying, okay, let's take some time to actually review these accomplishments against our expectations. Evaluate them and say, hey, could we improve our execution? Are our plans good? Were the metrics we were collecting actually useful?
So plans are what they sound like, which is that when times are calm, we actually sit down as a team and we say, what are the things that we do here? Who does these things? How do they do them? And when do they do them? And we actually record these. Again, documentation, things that help people understand how to follow through on the things that we expect to be done, even if those people that do them now aren't here tomorrow. So an example of a plan, or an excerpt of a plan, is shown here. And it's OK if you can't read some of the text in the back. We'll kind of explain what's going on here. But first, we start with a description of the purpose. So why are we doing these processes? Why is this process one of the ones we chose to write down? What are we hoping to accomplish? Then we go through the plan and we describe sort of step by step the process of how we want to do things. So this plan is about doing code reviews. This is just one example of a step where we talk about how you accomplish a code review. But then even more interestingly and more beneficially, these plans cover all the exceptional cases as well. So we talked about how process can help reduce power conflicts. Think about on a code review, if an author and a reviewer disagree about a change that needs to be made, who wins? On some teams, it'll be the code author. They get to decide whether they change their code or not. On other teams, it'll be the reviewer. In other words, the author has to make all of the changes that the reviewer requests, and they don't get to reject any. Worse still, on some teams, it depends on the individual dynamics between those two individuals, whoever can shout down or argue down the other person. Here, we've depersonalized that conflict and said, if the two parties can't agree, then it goes to the tech lead, and the tech lead makes the decision. In this way, it helps it not feel so arbitrary, like it's not being imposed on somebody, but instead everybody understands what's expected, and when a decision is made that might go against them, they realize, well, in the future, it might go for me. But you can also capture other types of exceptional circumstances that come up along the way. So in this particular plan, we started to realize that sometimes we had defects in code reviews that we didn't want to fix in the code review, but we still wanted to fix them. So we asked ourselves, what do we want to do in that circumstance? And here we've specified that we'll just put it in the external bug tracking system, and then you can close the review and everything goes on fine. Now in future sprints or future code reviews, when we're up against the wall and we're like, we don't have time to fix this bug, what do we do? Is it OK to have bugs? Our plan tells us it is, so we can be relaxed. We know what to do.
Another thing that I think is really often overlooked is this whole idea of actually defining roles and responsibilities, right? This is actually a very integral part of what makes a team functional. So here, when we look at the code review process, we list the people who participate in that particular process. And we actually list out the responsibilities that each person plays within that process. And this way, again, there's no question of, what should I do? Should I be doing this? Should I not be doing this? Should this person be doing this? Is this person doing enough? There's no question. Everybody knows exactly what needs to be done. Another easy way to add process into your organization that's less stressful than, tons of meetings and things like that, is just by creating checklists. So when you're doing something and you have a process within an organization and you write things down, then all of a sudden it's going to reduce the errors that you make over time. Right? It's also going to help people like junior developers or new team members know exactly what to do. You can just hand them a piece of paper. One thing that I used to do actually I still do it. Every time I teach somebody something, I create a Zoom video for it, and then I put it in a how-to folder. So anytime somebody needs to learn something, whether it's logging into MailChimp or whatever, or doing something with AWS, they just watch the video, everybody knows how to do it. We also get really busy and stressed out sometimes, right? Especially during launch times. So when you have a checklist, it can make even yourself feel better about it because you know that, hey, everything might be crazy, but I can always refer back to this checklist.
So we've talked about a lot of reviews. Now we talked about code review. We're going to talk in another slide about different types of reviews that go on. But review is an important part of process. Because you want to make sure that people are doing what they say that they're doing in the ways that you expect them to be doing it. And so some of the benefits of doing this is that, of course, you get improved quality, right? Reviews catch mistakes. You also get this cross-pollination of ideas, right? When people review things that they're unfamiliar with, they learn, and you share that knowledge. You also get this redundant learning, as I just mentioned. And then you have reduced stress, and you eliminate the fear of making mistakes. And this is a very counterintuitive fact, but that when you know that people are going to be checking your work, you'd think you'd be more prone to making mistakes because someone's going to catch them. You'd think the best circumstance is when you think nobody's looking, so you have to be perfect. And it turns out you don't. When you know somebody's going to be watching your back, you're actually much more relaxed and a lot less afraid of making mistakes, and therefore you actually make fewer mistakes because you're in your element.
So another thing you need to make sure you're doing is reviewing everything very often. My husband, he's actually the CTO of a compliance software company. Rob is not my husband. My husband who's sleeping right now. But he recently rolled something out to a client just a few days ago. They were going to roll out to 5,000 people. They rolled it out to 50,000 people without telling his company. And what happened was CEO, VP of sales, CTO, everybody jumped in. Nobody knew what was going on. Everybody just got really stressed out. Right? And this is a great example, again, of why you need to make sure you're reviewing things, make sure you have processes in place. But again, it's not just reviewing code like we're all used to, but it's meeting notes, designs, requirements, making sure they're right, tests, plans, right? And the last one is just messaging to clients to make sure, is everybody saying the same thing? Are you promising the same thing, the same deadlines? Do you have the same tone, et cetera? These are very important.
So the last part of the process is to review and to analyze the things that you've done, the measurements and metrics that you've taken, and how everybody enjoyed the processes. And you reflect and you try to figure out, are there things that we ended up doing that we didn't have plans for? Did we like the plans? Are there some of the things that we say we want to do, but we don't want to do it that way anymore? Were the metrics we took interesting? Were they useful? Were there better metrics we should capture? This is process improvement, and this is what makes process less of a hindrance and more of a benefit to your team, is over time you do things only because it's valuable to you, not because a book or a course or some blog post that you read says it's the thing that you should be doing.
So when you do Agile and you stand up and you do the stand-ups in the morning,
or the
wall
sits, yeah.
So let's talk about the next pillar, which is going to be abstractions. And what we're going to talk about here is actually how to make building software more accessible, right? So we're going to talk about tools, abstractions, and different approaches that are going to make your team achieve greater happiness and productivity overall. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that web development is actually hard. I mean, you need to be a performance expert, security expert, accessibility expert, responsive design, browser compatibility, progressive web apps. Even for me, recently, I needed to write something, and I was like, man, I don't know if I know semantic HTML as well as I should. I better get back up on that. So every year, there's more to learn, and it gets more difficult to be successful these days, right? This is why we call it JavaScript fatigue, because, even amongst not just juniors, but mid-level, senior level, it's just the web is constantly changing, and the requirements to be a great developer is constantly changing. And the problem with this is actually the complexity of our industry is a barrier to entry, right? As a junior developer, you might take a general, let's say, HTML, CSS, JavaScript class, but are you learning all the semantic HTML? Are you learning about accessibility? Are you learning about performance? Every time we say this is what it means to be a junior developer, it changes. Right? So you never feel like you're actually good enough. And this leads to juniors being just completely lost in our industry. It makes them feel inferior, makes them feel like things are churning, right? Even seniors feel overwhelmed. So imagine what that means for juniors. And if you just search on Google, for example, you can see that, people are overwhelmed, right? If you search junior web developer overwhelmed, I mean, everybody is just talking about how they're overwhelmed.
But it's not all bad. There are a lot of tools out there that can really help, right? And the first and foremost of them, on the web anyways, are frameworks. Frameworks are a really powerful tool to do the right thing out of the box for people that may not understand fully how all of the technology fits together. I know myself, even after I'd done development for many years, but coming back to the web after so much had changed, using a framework helped me contribute meaningfully, even though I still needed to understand more deeply how cookies worked and how authorization worked and all these different things. But the frameworks helped abstract some of that complexity and help me out. So to show an example of this, I wanted to talk about Google's AMP framework. And they have this tool, or this component, AMP image, which is literally just an image tag like you would see in HTML, but underneath the hood, it does all sorts of stuff for you that you would otherwise have to do yourself, such as resizing the image based on the user's viewport, or preloading it based on how far down on the page it appears and how far the user has scrolled. You get all sorts of automatic translation and compression when your pages go into the AMP cache. Again, all of these things are things that you could do, and a lot of senior developers do on their projects, but that the framework does for you. And then as you learn those things, you might not need to rely on technology like this, but it's there for the ones that do while you are learning that, so that you're still delivering good experiences to your users.
Also, I love CLI tools. So when I learned web development, I started with Ember CLI, and then quickly transitioned over to Angular CLI after a while. But the CLI tools are so awesome because you can scaffold an application from scratch, right? You have the zero config environments, you have the smart defaults, the out-of-box performance, like automatic differential serving and lazy loading and tree shaking, ahead-of-time compilation. All the major frameworks have them. And these tools are also actively maintained and kept up to date, which reduces the load on teams, for example. And they help you migrate between major versions of different libraries, which is awesome. And there's so much documentation out there that says, hey, do this with the CLI. So that is much easier than you having to write your own documentation and write your own tech stack. One of our clients, I was just on a call yesterday, and one of our clients doesn't want to use Vaadin router. We're doing Polymer, Vaadin router, and because of the hashing. So we had to rewrite a router for them. And I was thinking, oh my God, we spent a week doing this. You could have saved so much time and energy if you just said, look, we're just going to use the standard out there. And the great part about CLIs is they're also very low risk because you can always eject if you want.
Great. So another tool that's really useful, and it's a bit counterintuitive again, because state management libraries like NGRX for Angular or Redux for React or MobX and ones like it, people feel like those are tools that are specifically for senior engineers. And to some degree, that's true. I think you do want architects or senior engineers to help set up your state management solutions, but when you do it correctly, it isolates a lot of very complicated business logic, which can often be very difficult to write, from the creation of your UIs and your presentation logic. This creates an ability for your junior developers to focus on building interesting components without getting caught up in a lot of the real-time requirements and a lot of the complicated business logic that your senior developers can focus on. And the way that these state management libraries work, I like to make a reference to Amazon Dash buttons. Has anybody here ever even seen these or heard of these? So the idea behind this is that you can press the button on this, and it's going to order this product and ship it to your house. Now, you don't have to know when you press this button how this thing connects to your Wi-Fi, or how it orders, or how it decides where to ship it, or how it debits your account. You just know you press the button, and the product arrives. Similarly, these state management libraries, when you've done it correctly, you basically give your developers a handful of these dash buttons for your UI. And as long as they make sure that the UI presses those buttons appropriately, the important things happen as you expect.
So side note, does it have to connect to the Wi-Fi? Does it connect to your Wi-Fi? OK. I just press it. My husband sets it all up, so who knows? So another thing I love about our technology and our industry is things like TYPESCRIPT, right? When you use something like TYPESCRIPT, it's so much easier because with JavaScript, you can get carried away with, writing way too much code and confusing bits of code. But with TypeScript, you are kind of forced to have strongly typed methods, variables, and services. One of the things that we ended up doing when we were rewriting RxJS, we basically migrated it all to TypeScript, is there weren't any bugs per se, but we actually uncovered a lot of different bugs that weren't noticeable to us in JavaScript, but TypeScript unearthed them. So when you write things in TypeScript as well, it makes it so much easier to understand the functionality and the purpose of each part of the code. And there's also stricter rules, which means less bugs, like I just said. And instead of trying to figure out what method is going to return what and how to treat each new thing, you know exactly what to expect and plan because TypeScript tells you. Also, it has better error handling, which is extremely useful, so you can spot the root of the problem a lot easier. And I really love the more descriptive errors that it gives you within the console as well. And the other great thing is that when you use something like TypeScript, it helps juniors learn, right? Because with that strongly typed language, it makes them much more careful when designing new things and also helps them teach best practices. I think everybody from the .NET world can really appreciate this because I remember going from JavaScript to .NET, I was like, it feels so comfortable, because I was so familiar with something like TypeScript.
So if anybody's been on a lot of different web projects, you probably remember that the first month or so is always built towards designing your new date picker and your new autocomplete box and your new modal windows over and over and over again for our entire careers. Or another thing that we see is something that I like to call the Bob Ross problem, which is this happens when developers get a new design spec from a designer and they begin to implement it completely from scratch as if no other CSS or HTML exists in the system. And this means that every page is different and you just keep building and growing new CSS and new HTML. Then people start using the important attribute and then it's all gone from there, right? You can't recover.
So this is why it's so important to use things like design systems and component libraries, because this really helps the quality of the project. And depending on the talent you have available, you can either create your own design system or you can use one that's already there. There's so many different open source alternatives. I really like Shopify's Polaris system and Google's Material Design. If you do React, Ryan Florence's Reach router kind of is getting there somehow from a design system perspective, but it gives you a lot of best practices, right, that you can follow. So, this also helps, like if you're using something like a material design, which if I didn't have material design when I first started development, my websites would not be as beautiful. But I was able to build websites just like that overnight, so I love it. And, again, there's just so many. I mean, Reach UI, Material UI, Downshift, Polaris. I mean, these all provide really great building blocks for you to build your application. The other great part about this is that when you're using somebody else's technologies, you don't have to worry about the accessibility and the performance of the components. It's already there for you. We love our clients, but we always try to convince them, like, please don't make us build another date picker. Can we use a design system or component library that's already out there? They don't realize that, they're adding on, months and years of development on building it themselves. So please use component libraries.
Yeah. So if people do web development, I'm going to give you a tip for 2020. You get a leg up if you start learning now, that state machines are going to be everywhere.
Yes, they already are everywhere.
Right, and just like state management, state machines are a really great way to isolate business logic in a different way than state management, but it defines some discrete states of your application and how you transition between them. And these are become really good at isolating complexity in web apps. But you don't have to take my word for it. People like David here, who wrote XState, one of the popular state machines, gave an amazing talk about how to write automated creation of unit tests based on state machines. And Dave Geddes jumped all on this and started using them in the games that he produces and has been raving about their success. And Ryan Florence has been there since day one and is always talking about how his use of state machines actually minimizes the amount of code he has to change to make really meaningful edits to his behavior of his applications. So here's an example of a state machine, and don't worry that you can't read this. You're not meant to. It's just meant to show that these state machines can get quite complex, and even more complex than this. This is an example from Ryan Florence's checkout page for his workshop site. And the state machine covers all sorts of edge cases, like people buying tickets to a workshop that's sold out, or not having enough money, or trying to use discount codes. He's accounted for every normal and abnormal case in his flow, and it's all encoded here. Now, he can take this state machine and then build an app out of Angular or React or Vue or literally any tool that he wants, and as long as he connects it correctly to the state machine that was produced here, he has some feeling that what he's built is correct.
And I love that because it basically makes it a logic problem, a business problem, not a code problem, which is extremely useful. So we talked about two pillars so far, process and abstractions, but now let's talk about mentorship. And the reason why I really like talking about mentorship is because this actually creates and is supposed to create a culture shift from within your organization. So when we think about a proper culture of mentorship, imagine if you had a team where you could not be promoted unless you could nominate somebody to be promoted into your role. All of a sudden, it's not beneficial to be a 10x developer and write the most amount of code, but it's actually more beneficial for you to help other developers. So all of a sudden, it's the sort of like the fall of the rockstar developer and the rise of this idea of a rockstar mentor. Sorry. Mentorship actually has a lot of significant and positive effects. So with mentees, it accelerates their learning and growth. It increases their confidence. It decreases their fear of contribution and collaboration. So I remember when I joined the RxJS core team, I was like, I'm so unqualified to be in these meetings. And so I'd wait till after the meeting and say, hey, I had this idea. What do you think? Was this okay to say in the meeting? Now I feel much more comfortable because, Ben, who's one of the main maintainers, said, yeah, it's totally fine, right? So I don't care anymore. It also increases communication skills of the mentees, right? Because they have to talk about code, and the more you talk about code, the better off you are. Also, mentees feel more invested in and valued, and it actually increases their mobility upwards. So Sun Microsystems found that mentees are actually 5 times more likely to be promoted. And the other great part about mentees is, again, you're creating this culture where the mentees all of a sudden become mentors, and it passes the benefits along within the organization.
But mentorship isn't just a charity thing. It's not a benefit that we're giving to these employees. It's not something that hurts the rest of the team to help out junior developers or whoever's being mentored. It actually has a lot of positive benefits for the companies and the mentors themselves. So this is a great retention tool and a great perk for recruiting. So this is great for companies. It reduces your knowledge silos and improves that hit by a bus factor that we talked about, right? It makes people more able to fill in roles across your organization. This means it's a lot cheaper to replace people, but realistically, they're not leaving because they're fulfilled from being mentored. Creates a more positive team culture, brings people together. So again, it helps solidify what your culture is. And interestingly enough, just like the mentees, the mentors are also more likely to be promoted. This is because they get to practice their communication skills, their leadership skills, and they also learn a lot. And I can say this from the people that I've mentored. I had to learn a lot to be able to answer the insightful questions that my mentees asked. So I became a better developer just by mentoring someone else. This is not a one-way street. This is not just charity that we do for these individuals. So What are some of the things that fit in a mentorship program? Well, of course, you're going to talk about things like technical challenges. So you'll answer questions like what is state management or reactive programming or unidirectional data flow or how to write unit tests, all sorts of things like that. Things that most people think of when they think of this type of mentorship. But of course, you also have professional instruction. So you'll talk about what makes a good requirement, or what are the different roles on a team. How do you participate in a code review, or be how do you write a useful software design? And how do you fix defects, or what makes something a defect versus a new feature? Sometimes these are things that aren't taught in a lot of CS programs or boot camps, so it's great to reinforce them in mentoring. Non-technical skills are a big thing. So this is how to manage and navigate office politics, how to be a good follower, a good leader, emotional intelligence, how to speak to clients. This is, of course, a really important part of mentoring. Career development, which is another thing that a lot of people think of, right? You want to help these people understand where they are, where they want to go, and what those next steps will be. A lot of people are just happy to be part of this industry, and they'll say yes to everything. And I've sat down with people and said, you agreed to do this AWS certification. You do almost all front-end work. Do you want to be a back-end developer? That's fine, but is that something you actually want to do, or did you just not want to say no? And it really helps them understand where they want to go, and you can give them suggestions as well. And the last piece that I love to call out is this idea of radical candor. So it's this book, it comes from this book by Kim Scott, and it talks about this idea where a lot of mentors, when they're working with mentees, think that their job is to make the mentee feel happy all the time. So they think they need to tell them, you're the best developer ever, you're so good, you never make mistakes, you're really going to be something in this industry, right? And they just keep pumping them up and pumping them up. Now, of course, we want our mentees to feel safe and feel successful, but we don't want to lie to them. We want to make sure that they're still getting truth from us. Because if a mentee is getting only positive feedback from their mentor, then they go out in the world and they receive strongly negative feedback, they feel like they've been betrayed. It's a betrayal of trust. So of course we want to be compassionate. We don't want to be overly mean or overly truthful, but we want to make sure that we're giving mentees both positive and negative or constructive criticism, negative feedback in our mentorship sessions so that they know that we're being honest with them.
So you might say, okay, fine, mentorship is good, and I'm sure everybody can agree that mentorship is good, but how do I add this to my team, right? What does this actually look like? So you can do a lot of different things when it comes to mentorship. Number one is just doing formal one-on-one sessions where a junior and a senior maybe go into a room and talk about technical things. You can do code reviews as well, right? So if if an author is learning from the comments that a reviewer gives of, hey, can you explain this code to me? Then the author gets better. And also reviewers actually learn new patterns or understand important parts about the system that they might not have before because of the author's code. Also pair programming, where you're letting the junior write and you're just talking to them and telling them how to do something. This was really useful for me. This is how I learned a lot of my development. Also tech talks, so you can just encourage this whole idea of knowledge sharing, right? You can set up lunches and say, hey, I'm going to give a 5-minute talk about this new thing I learned. We've seen a lot of this in internal organizations where it starts off with a group of 5 people sharing tech talks, and then it quickly grows to like 100 people over lunch giving tech talks. Also different chat channels, just starting a chat channel. We have one called Dev Party, where developers can just talk about whatever they want on the technical side. And it's really helpful to just have these types of things, water cooler conversations. Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about a lot of things today, but we like to sum it up in the PAM stack just because it's fun to say, and it really makes people wonder, like, wow, I didn't see that. Where did that come from? But it, again, is process, abstractions, and mentorship.
Yeah, and another thing as well, a lot of juniors come up to us after this and say, how do I actually do this within my organization? So if you're learning something, you can simply just write things down and say, hey, I wrote down how to get my dev environment set up, and then share it within your team. I'll bet you that the architect is going to start using that overall, right? Mentor and help your peers that are being onboarded, so you're creating a culture of mentorship already, right? Ask questions about the project, the code, the process, document those things and share it with others. Ask for code reviews proactively and also give code reviews. it's always funny when the most senior developer, can merge his or her own code. But, if somebody's all of a sudden starting to wonder about that code in an innocent way, it's making everybody better, right? It's encouraging that type of mentorship. And if your team loves that process or ideas, then you can ask for that to be formally incorporated into the process.
So yeah, so that's it for us. Hopefully that was interesting to you, and hopefully, whether you're an architect, a project leader, a mid-level developer, a junior developer, you can take some of these things back to your teams and enjoy the benefits. So thank you everybody very much.
Thank you.